Good afternoon, everybody. A lovely sunny day for us all again. Here we are back in the basement. I hope you enjoyed the Jane Austen concert I streamed for you last week. We're going to stay very much in a similar period of history, actually, which is partly why I wanted to do it, to put the Jane Austen stuff first. Jane Austen's dates, as we know, 1775 to 1817. So in that patch, crossing over the century. And then Beethoven, just slightly longer on both sides, 1770 to 1827. So a couple, sort of 5 years, born 5 years older, 5 years before Austen and died 10 years after Austen. So covering a very, very similar period of history. Beethoven, as we know, had started off with his feet and his roots very much in the classical period. And by the end of his lifetime, he was really paving the way for the Romantic period with all of his sort of massive changes of dynamics and exploring form and letting go of sort of some of the rules and confines that the classical period had already sort of scripted by this point. So I've got a sort of slightly interesting / daunting task of going through the Beethoven sonatas, 32 sonatas in total. Not going to play them all because I think we'll be here till next week. But 32 sonatas with, there's another 3 early sonatas. So in more recent editions, there's 35 sonatas altogether. But this first sonata that has become sort of commonly known as the first one, in F minor, Opus 2, number 1, it really sets a precedence for what's going to come next. He's sort of grown up with the works of Bach and Mozart and form and knows all about all these different textures, but he's sort of saying right from the beginning, okay, I'm not going to be writing these sonatas for a harpsichord. I'm going to be exploring the options that we've got available for our new forte piano that we've got. The forte piano was able to explore greater sonority, able to sustain chords, able to show the difference between staccatos and then longer notes. So quite a contrast from the sort of plucked strings of a harpsichord, which had its own limitations. Beautiful instrument though it is. And we've seen in the Jane Austen concert how that sort of transgression of instruments happens in that concert. So right from those opening bars of the first sonata, he's saying, okay, I want to have lots of different dynamics. I want to show you my staccato. I want to really grab this and roll with it. So here is the opening of his first sonata. And he can't help himself with that question. He sort of sets you all up and then he stops and gives you a sort of question and what's going to happen after that. And then so on and so on. A sonata that we all know and love. So he's really sort of showing us, okay, I'm going to just do something slightly different with this form. One of the next sonatas in this early period of sonatas, Beethoven's life has been sort of moved into 3 periods, if you like. The first one being the period before and just slightly encompassing the turn of the century. And it was really a sort of tumultuous time in Europe where, Napoleon was starting to stride forth. There were sort of noises of the French Revolution and then that really taking grip. So, there was a lot of sort of anxieties and tensions, something that we're all rather familiar with at the moment in our global pandemic. But certainly in Beethoven's day, this early period, he was really sort of watching and listening to what was around him and also finding his own sound. So right early on in his 5th sonata, Opus 10, in that key of fate, that C minor, again he's showing, here's the dynamics, here's the contrasts. Straight into that C minor, that some crashing sort of sound that we know and love. So coming through that early period, he's still very much sort of staying within the classical period, but exploring some of these things where he might start with a quieter theme and then go into something different, or he might start with a slow introduction. He's really starting to mix and match it. So towards the end, and again on that cusp of the turn of the century, the Pathetique Sonata in that first collection of sonatas really starts to say, okay, things are going to start to change now. And he comes straight in with this catastrophically, slightly demonic C minor chord, to say, okay, something's going to change. As we know, it carries on and into that sort of exciting tension. And as if you're a budding pianist wanting to learn the piano, we've got that very famous second movement in the Pathetique, again in this early patch of Beethoven's writing, with that beautiful long sustained melody. He's really taking use of the pedal that this forte piano allowed, and he's really taking control of this long line. So it's very different to some of the writings of Haydn and Mozart. Haydn at this point was taking Europe and England by storm, writing his creation and really sort of mixing it up a little bit. So everyone was taking this turn of the century and this Sturm und Drang, this sort of power and passion, and taking it into a new generation. So we find ourselves in the middle period of Beethoven. At this point, things are starting to go a little bit wrong with Beethoven's hearing, and anybody with a hearing loss, is very, very aware of that, and very, very aware of the implications of what that means over a long period of time, and also very aware of vibration and the vibrations of life and the rhythms of life. And so he starts to explore vibration a little bit more in his playing. And there's a sort of humbleness that starts to creep in. And you'll hear this at the beginning of the 12th sonata, and it's written over 1801, really signifying the beginning of this middle period. And it goes into the funeral march of the Eroica, as we know. And with this sonata, he starts off with variation form, and with those variation, he's starting to explore all sorts of different compositional techniques, which he develops in all of his compositions. And it just to start off and say, right, okay, I'm not going to have classical sort of sonata form. Here's a theme, here's another theme, here's a development, and here it comes back again in the recapitulation. He's saying, I'm going to take something and I'm just going to stay with that idea and then develop it a little bit more and develop it a little bit more, really giving you a sort of sign of things to come. And in that middle period, he really explores these fantasy sonatas, a couple of fantasy sonatas for you. The most famous one, obviously, is the Moonlight, which, again, lots of budding pianists go to try it. I've seen all sorts of just extraordinary editions where, rather than it being C sharp minor, which has got the 4 sharps, and then there's that little tricky bit at the end where it sort of moves up the piano and everyone has to understand what a double sharp is and all of these exciting things. I've seen editions where they sort of chunk it down, they'll chunk it up a little bit into D minor, which is all on the white notes, that sort of slightly Einaudi approach of piano playing, which does lose that deliciousness of the C sharp minor. But it's sort of absolutely sort of iconic work. One of the things which is interesting and slightly, for us as modern pianists, slightly ambiguous, is one of his markings that he writes where he says senza sordino, meaning with so leaving the pedal on, leaving the sound of the piano just to take over. So literally means keeping your right foot down for the whole thing. Which on a modern piano you start to get in very, very deep water because you get those rather blurred bass notes. But on an older piano, on a forte piano, the sound decay, as we call it, where the sound sort of drops off after the note's been played, was much quicker. So you can get away with it, but sort of pianists have really grappled with that marking, and it comes back a little bit in the later sonatas that I'll talk about in a minute. So it's an important one because Beethoven is really starting to say what he wants in his score. He's saying, right, okay, I want this going on and I want this going on, rather than sort of saying piano forte that you get sometimes in the classical compositions. And like I said, the Moonlight Sonata, it starts off fairly easily, nice, reasonably easy second movement. Playful, it sounds nice and easy, and then you get to the one where everyone slightly sort of trips up because it's suddenly all the fireworks are let off. We're in the middle of a storm. Here he goes, letting rip. And at the end of the sonata, Henry Wood, the developer of the founder, developer and rather wonderful musician, rather famously said, the pianists go onward to their doom. I was very much saying, okay, here we go. You've got to start to have a really good technique by the end of the sonata. It's not just all about that easy first movement. But that really is one of the sort of iconic works of the middle period of Beethoven. And towards the end, we get the rather delicious Waldstein Sonata, starting off with the pianissimo opening. And as Beethoven started his sonatas with that, he started that with that piano opening, and he ends the whole of his cycle of sonatas with a pianissimo ending, saying, okay, it's very easy to play loudly, but can you play quietly? And he starts off the Waldstein with these call and answer phrases. Very very sort of interesting sort of sudden jump from the compass of the piano. Again, he's leaving all these questions and leaving all of these doors open for him to walk through and say, oh, okay, I'm going to take this door, I'm going to take the composition this way or that way, and leaving it ready for him to explore. So we get into the late sonatas, and you're probably wondering what on earth I'm going to play after sort of giving you a brief synopsis of the Beethoven sonatas. But I'm going to leave us sort of in the late sonatas. I always like to see the late compositions of a composer, because it really shows you what they've sort of spent their life's work crafting and what they really feel, and using all the sort of wisdom and authority that we gain as life progresses, and all the mistakes that we make and all the things that we like and think, oh yeah, maybe I'll go back to that. And so I am going to play one of the late sonatas, but to sort of herald the opening of that late patch of Beethoven. Remember, by this point, he's totally deaf. Just mind-blowing what that actually means for a musician. Thank goodness he was a composer and was able to still express what he had in his head, because can be a very insular world when you can't hear. So in Opus 90, so he's sort of saying, just exploring all these different ideas again. So there's, again, lots and lots of questions going on with these late sonatas, and it has to be said that Beethoven preferred the forte piano by the maker Broadwood. One of the reasons being he was one of the first to put in an iron frame. We talked a little bit about that with the Liszt concerts, where Liszt was renowned for breaking pianos, and the iron frame really sort of held it together, and it made you able to have this bigger, grander, slightly more symphonic sound that Beethoven used. And certainly in these late sonatas, you can just hear all the different orchestral lines coming through, and passing over from string players to wind players to percussion players that you would have got in the orchestra. And so the last three sonatas, Opus 9 in E major, Opus 10 in A flat major, and Opus 11, they're really they're sort of grappling with different forms, with fugal forms, he's really going for this bigger 4-movement sonata, so telling a story all the way through. There's variations, there's drama, there's just a sort of freedom of expression and a freedom of form that's just bursts out of the music. So the first one, Opus 9, 109, written at 1820. Sort of sincerity to that opening, and he goes into variations and explores all sorts of different ideas with that. But the sonata that I am going to play is the Opus 110. So this is his penultimate sonata that he wrote, and he wrote this in 1821. And right from the opening is a very warm key of A flat major, the same key that we heard in the second movement, the Pathetique. And it's this sort of warmth that he says, con animabiliata, you know, so real sort of really very warmth, loving sound that you get in the first movement. And it's almost sort of slightly, you know, it's come to terms with life. It's come to terms with the sort of Sturm und Drang and the anger of hearing loss and the sort of aggression and energy that you get in your youth, shall we say. And it's sort of saying, okay, I'm in the later stages of life, and these are my thoughts and what I want to pass on to you. So the first movement is beautifully warm and rich in sonority, and he can't help himself when he gets to the second movement to get a little bit of that drama back, that sort of F minor drama that we heard in the first sonata with the scherzo. All sorts of hand crossings and fireworks going off in the second movement. So interestingly, the end of the second movement sort of goes slightly seamlessly into the third movement, which is one of the most moving, very, very emotional, very thought-provoking movements that Beethoven was to write. It's like an aria and a recit. There's points where the bar isn't a bar, it's just an extended cadence or extended idea. And there's a couple of points where he's really sort of just sinking into a key and sinking into a sonority and almost feeling that vibration. A little bit like what we're talking about in the Moonlight Sonata, that holding the pedal down and sort of feeling the piano sort of moving underneath your hands and feeling that deep inside your heart. Out of the ashes, if you like, and out of this sort of real depths of despair comes a fugue, and comes that sort of glimmer of hope, the light through, like the beam of sunshine through the clouds on a sunny day, on a cloudy day. And when you hear that sort of fugue sort of coming through, the fugue subject, here it is. So it starts off in one line, then it comes in another. And as all my students will know, fugues are one of those complicated things to play because you've got sort of 3 or 4 lines going on simultaneously, and you've got to bring out the right part of the fugue in order to sort of hear that fugal subject. But he's not quite ready to give you an ending yet, because the fugue sort of goes into this second section of just deep and utter despair, martyred, and where he's really saying he's exhausted, where it goes back into G minor. So he's really saying, oh gosh, you know, I still quite haven't got my grief out of my system yet. And out of that, he very cleverly comes back with a fugue again, which is an inversion of his first fugue. So rather than it going up, down, it goes down, up. So you can hear it like this. not only does he invert it, he puts it in diminution, so he makes it twice as fast, and then he brings in the left hand again, and so it goes absolutely through all of the sort of feelings of emotions, all of the phases of life, I guess this sonata does, so that by the ending it sort of finishes in this absolutely sort of triumphant ending, and sort of a cascade of A flat major to bring it to a close. And I guess, you know, sort of it's just slightly out of the ashes the phoenix will come, and you know, that idea of the fugue at the end, it's gaining new life, it's coming back up for air. And yeah, I guess one of the reasons I wanted to play this was, you know, the feeling that we are at the moment, quite how we're going to come out of the lockdown that we're in, whether we're going to send our children back to school, all of these big life decisions that we're in the middle of at the moment. But there will be an end to it, and sort of sonatas like these really give us that sort of hope, and you know, somebody passing on their life story. So that's a very, very large, long opening, but I thought it was probably fitting, as we're going to be talking about Beethoven's works. So as we know, the 250th anniversary of the birth of Beethoven this year, we would have had all sorts of concerts and celebrations. There's still time, so we'll see how we go with all of that. But this is my very humble offering of the Opus 110 Sonata by Beethoven. Well, the penultimate Beethoven Sonata, Opus 110, written in A flat. Hopefully it's encompassed many of the ideas in Beethoven's piano writing, and give us a sort of a real whiff of that 250th anniversary, some of the iconic works that Beethoven wrote. Next week we'll still be here, as it seems, and I'm going to go back even further still. I've been sort of going from, I don't know, sort of the middle of the sort of 1940s backwards in time, I guess. So we're going back to a little bit of Baroque composition and exploring preludes. And what that then meant for future generations. So starting with some Bach preludes and playing some other preludes as well. So, perhaps a beginning and then a glimpse of what then happens. So I hope you can join us. Enjoy your sunny day. Enjoy trying to fathom out what we're meant to be doing or not meant to be doing. All of those good things in our lockdown this week. And my sincerest best wishes to you all. Thank you for coming.